Hey, did you know that in 1927, a man dressed as Santa strolled into a Texas bank and turned a quiet holiday afternoon into something very, very unexpected? He wasn't there to hand out presents or to spread Christmas cheer, but instead to pull off a robbery so chaotic it turned an entire town into a battlefield. Picture this. It's 2 days before Christmas in 1927. The streets of Cisco are very busy with people out for the holidays, and walking through downtown is a man dressed head to toe as Santa Claus. Children spot him and start trailing behind, excited to see Santa out in the open. He steps into the First National Bank with the kids following closely behind, and the moment he's inside, Santa reaches into his suit, doesn't pull out presents, but he pulls out a gun. And what happened next became one of the wildest crime stories in American history. This is the story of the Santa Claus bank robbery of 1927. Welcome everybody to another episode of Hey Did You Know, where we dig up the weird, the forgotten, and the downright strange corners of America. Before we dig into this story, I want to remind you, wherever you are, please hit that follow button because you're not going to want to miss an episode. We drop a new story every Wednesday, and while you're here, don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts because I'd love to know what you're thinking about the episode, or maybe even a past episode, and I might even feature one in a future episode. Having said that, let's get into today's story. If you've ever watched any old Hollywood Western films, you've probably seen all the classics. Train robberies, dusty shootouts, bank heists gone wrong. You've maybe even watched Paul Newman and Robert Redford as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Or you've heard the stories of Billy the Kid. But for the little town of Cisco, Texas, this wasn't a classic Western film. This was real life. And the man in the starring role? His name was Marshall Ratliff. So let's start at the beginning. Marshall Ratliff was an ex-con who actually lived in Cisco, Texas before being arrested for a bank robbery in Valeria, Texas. He was sentenced to 18 years, but just after 2, then Governor Miriam Ferguson pardoned him, which might not have been the best decision because the minute he walked out of that prison, Ratliff started planning a brand new heist, this time targeting his own hometown bank. He first tried to bring his brother Lee into the plan, but Lee had already been arrested yet again. So Ratliff turned to 2 men he knew from Huntsville, Henry Helms and Robert Hill. They'd also recruited a 4th man who was skilled with safes, but he caught the flu just as they were preparing for the job. The crew replaced him with a man named Lewis Davis, who was a relative of Helms and a family man who really needed the money, so they promised him a pretty generous payout. And with the crew set, the plan for one of the wildest holiday season crimes in Texas history was officially in motion. Now here's the part that really raises the stakes. During this period in Texas, bank robberies weren't rare. They pretty much were routine. On average, 4 banks were being robbed every single day. So the Texas Bankers Association made a bold announcement. Anyone who killed a bank robber would receive a $5,000 reward, which today is $93,000. Think you'd kill a bank robber for that? I think I would. In other words, robbing a bank in Texas at this time was not just a risk, but practically a death sentence. So let's talk about the robbery itself. The 4 men stole a car in Wichita Falls and headed straight for Cisco, convinced they were about to make themselves some easy money. But Ratliff had one problem. Everyone in Cisco knew his face. If he showed up unmasked, it would have ended the heist before it even started. So a solution? A Santa suit. Since the robbery was planned for late December, Ratliff figured the perfect disguise was the one and only person no one would ever question that close to Christmas. He brought a Santa suit and a Santa beard from the woman who ran their boarding house, and on the morning of December 23rd, the crew rolled into Cisco, Texas. And as they approached the town, Ratliff put on the full Santa outfit and had the others drop him off a few blocks from the bank while they got the getaway car into position. The plan was simple. Santa walks in, the gang follows, grab the cash, and escape to the side alley to the car waiting at the end of the block. And one day before Christmas Eve, of course, nobody batted an eye as Santa Claus strolled down the street in the middle of the afternoon. In fact, kids ran to him. They swarmed Ratliff, asking him questions, tugging on his suit, just thrilled to see Santa Claus in person. and he stayed calm, played the part, and gently steered the growing crowd towards the bank. By the time he managed to shake off the kids and step inside, he thought the money was just as good as theirs. But once he got inside, Ratliff was faced with 4 people, 2 bank tellers and 2 customers. They greeted him politely, saying hello, but he didn't respond. His attention was caught by 2 4th-grade girls who were entering the lobby from the bookkeeping room. A bank patron by the name of B.P. Blazingame arrived, tugged along by her 6-year-old daughter, Frances, who was very excited to see Santa Claus. That's when Ratliff's accomplices stormed in, pistols raised, and shouted, "Hands up." Santa quickly took control. He ordered the teller to open the safe and began stuffing money and bonds into the sack hidden beneath his costume. While the others kept watch over the customers and employees, Ratliff forced the teller to open the vault and grabbed as much cash as he could. Miss Blazingame managed to escape with her daughter through the bookkeeping office and ran out into the alley. She ran straight to the police department, alerting Chief George Emery Bedford. And since she was in a panic, she also alerted most of the town about the robbery as well. Chief Bedford grabbed a riot gun and rushed to the scene, instructing 2 officers to follow. He stationed himself at the front of the alley while the officers took positions in the back, setting up a deadly trap for the robbers. When the bandits realized the bank was surrounded, they herded their hostages into the back room by the alley door, where they ran into 2 more bookkeepers. The robbers couldn't step into the alley without facing withering fire from the police and a growing crowd of armed townspeople, but now they had 8 hostages, including 2 4th-grade girls. Using the frightened civilians as human shields, the bandits forced their way into the alley, trying to make their escape under cover of the hostages. What happened next would turn this daring heist into the legend that it is today. Despite using the hostages as shields, chaos erupted. A barrage of gunfire tore through the alley, wounding all 4 bandits and several of the hostages. Somehow, the gang managed to reach their getaway car and speed out of town with the 2 little girls still in tow. Chief Bedford and one of his deputies, George Carmichael, were both struck and left mortally wounded in the alley. Bedford died just a few hours later, and Carmichael succumbed to his injuries 2 weeks after the attack. As the 4 bandits tried to make their escape, heading south on the main road with their hostages, they began tossing handfuls of roofing nails onto the road, hoping to blow the tires of the pursuing officers and armed townspeople. The trick worked for a moment, but their relief didn't last long. They suddenly realized they were nearly out of gas. Either a bullet had punctured their tank, or they had simply forgotten the refill after the long drive from Wichita Falls. With the chase tightening behind them and the edge of town approaching, they spotted a passing Oldsmobile driven by a 14-year-old Woodrow Wilson Harris. He was given permission by his family to drive into town for some last-minute Christmas shopping, his father in the passenger seat and his mother and grandmother in the back. The robbers forced the family out and quickly tried to move everything over: hostages, stolen money, and Lewis Davis, who had been critically wounded. And just as they piled into their new getaway car, they made the discovery that the Oldsmobile wouldn't start because young Harris had quietly slipped the keys from the ignition the moment he was ordered to stop. With Davis now unconscious, the gang abandoned him in the Oldsmobile, grabbed the 2 hostages, and scrambled back into the original car to continue the escape. The gang had stolen $12,400 in cash and $150,000 in non-negotiable securities, which is savings bonds and bank deposits, stuff like that, making it the largest bank robbery in Texas history at the time. At least it would have been. Instead, every bit of the loot was found sitting in the Harris family's abandoned car beside the gravely injured Lewis Davis. In the chaos of switching cars, they hadn't realized they had left the entire haul behind. When the armed townspeople reached the vehicle, they found Davis's barely conscious body and the bag of money untouched. The crowd paused their pursuit long enough to call for help and return the funds to the bank. And as for Lewis Davis, the last-minute stand-in for the gang, well, this would be the only crime he ever took part in. He never made it to trial because on Christmas Day, he died from the gunshot wounds he'd suffered during the firefight inside the bank. The 3 remaining bandits, still clutching to the 2 young hostages, sped down the main road before veering east into a dirt track. They barreled through a pasture, plowing through cactus and thick bush until the growth became too dense to push through. With their getaway car riddled with bullets and no path forward, they ditched the vehicle and the 2 frightened children several miles outside of town, then disappeared into the wilderness on foot. Meanwhile, Sheriff John Hart and his Eastland County deputies had already been alerted. They rushed to the abandoned car and word of the robbery spread like wildfire. Within hours, officers and armed civilians from all across West Texas were pouring in, launching what would become one of the largest manhunts in this region. Search parties fanned out across fields and pastures. One group found an overcoat and a pair of blood-soaked gloves. Later, a suitcase turned up along with blood-stained rags and medical supplies inside, cotton, gauze, all signs that the game had come prepared, fully aware that this robbery might end up in violence. Nightfall would bring the first day's chase to an end, but it picked right back up the next day, and again on Christmas Day. On the evening of Christmas, the three remaining bandits managed to seize another vehicle, this one driven by a young oil field driller named Carl Wiley. They forced him at gunpoint to stay behind the wheel as their new hostage. In the chaos of the abduction, Carl's father caught sight of the getaway and fired a shotgun at the fleeing car, desperate to stop the robbers. After hiding through the icy Christmas night, Helms, Hill, and Ratliff managed to steal yet another car. They released Carl Wiley and let him keep his vehicle. When Wiley finally reached the authorities, he reported that the bandits were in terrible shape, bleeding, exhausted, hungry, and struggling against the freezing sleet that had set over North Texas. The next morning, the trio crossed over the Brazos River near the small town of South Bend, but waiting for them was Young County Sheriff Foster. The moment the outlaws approached the river crossing, the ambush sprang to life. Another furious chase erupted, ending in a gunfight in an open field. Deputy Sheriff Cy Bradford joined the fray, and legend has it he managed to hit all three robbers with his rifle. Ratliff went down immediately, collapsing into the frozen ground. Helms and Hill, though wounded, bolted for the hills and vanished into the brush. Ratliff, when he finally was brought in, was reportedly a walking arsenal. He had been shot 6 times and was still carrying 6 pistols, one of which he had stolen straight from the bank during the heist. But injuries, guns, and the Santa Claus suit couldn't save him now. Santa had been caught. For days, the two fugitives Helms and Hill dodged a massive, relentless manhunt, one so serious it even included an airplane, which was a rarity for local chases in the 1920s. But their luck had finally run out. Weak, injured, and worn down by the cold, Helms and Hill limped into the town of Graham, where lawmen arrested them without a struggle. Ratliff was the first of the surviving robbers to stand trial. For the armed robbery of the First National Bank of Cisco, he was given a life sentence. Henry Helms, ironically the son of a pastor, went next. Unlike Ratliff, he was sentenced to death. His lawyer appealed, but the verdict would ultimately stand. Robert Hill took a different path. He pled guilty at the sentencing. His court-appointed attorney had him take the stand to tell the story of his childhood. An orphan who had spent his youth in the Gatesville State School for Boys, a place that functioned as both a reform institution and a foster care system. And because of that story, the jury spared him, choosing a life sentence or the death penalty. But Ratliff wasn't done facing the courts. Because 2 lawmen had been killed during the robbery, he was brought up on additional charges. His lawyer requested a change of venue and the trials removed. The case for Sheriff George Bedford's death went to Abilene, and the case for Deputy George Carmichael's death went to the small town of Anson. The results were grim. Abilene sentenced him to death, and Anson sentenced him to another life sentence on top of it. While awaiting for his appeals on death row, Ratliff received a wind-up phonograph and a stack of gospel records from his mother. As condemned men were escorted past his cell on their way to the electric chair, he played a song by the name of When the Roll is Called Up Yonder. Between 1928 and 1929, 7 men walked to their executions to that somber soundtrack. But when Henry Helms passed Ratliff's cell on September 6, 1929, on his way to the electric chair, Ratliff did not play the song. Helms himself had tried to avoid the chair by faking insanity. An Eastland County jury took only 10 minutes to decide that he was sane, and he was executed that same day. His family never claimed his body. Ratliff too began acting insane, conveniently on the very same day Helms died. His mother filed for a lunacy hearing, but the people of Eastland County had run out of patience. They had already felt Ratliff's execution had been delayed long enough, and this new insanity claim only deepened their anger. And unlike their earlier attempts by others, Ratliff's performance was convincing enough that his jailers let their guard down, which proved to be fatal. On November 18th, 1929, Ratliff slipped out of his unlocked cell, made his way into the jail office, and grabbed a six-shooter. He fatally shot one jailer and brutally fought with the other before the second jailer managed to beat him into unconsciousness and drag him back to his cell. But by then, word had spread. The next morning, a crowd began to gather outside the jail. By nightfall, nearly 1,000 people had assembled. A group of 15 to 20 men forced their way inside, pulled Ratliff from his cell, and dragged him into the street. They threw a rope over a telephone pole, and the first attempt, the rope snapped, and Ratliff fell to the ground. But on the second attempt, they used a stronger rope. And just like that, almost 2 years after he robbed the Cisco Bank dressed as Santa Claus, Marshall Ratliff's story has come to a violent end. In the years that followed, the Santa Claus bank robbery became more than just a sensational crime story. It turned into a local legend. Many families in Eastland County still claim that their grandparents or great-grandparents were there that day, whether at the bank or at the lynching. The tale has woven itself so deeply into local memory that it is hard to separate fact from folklore. In 1967, the Texas State Historical Survey Committee, what we now know as the Texas Historical Commission, placed an official medallion at the site of the robbery in Cisco. Across from the old Eastland County Jail, a granite marker stands where Marshall Ratliff was lynched. And that, my friends, is the wild, unbelievable, and very real story of the Santa Claus bank robbery of 1927. A crime so chaotic, so tragic, and so bizarre that it still echoes through Texas nearly a century later. From a small-town bank packed with holiday shoppers to a Santa suit soaked in gunpowder and grit, to a manhunt that turned the West Texas plains into a full-blown battleground. Remember when I said it wasn't a classic Western film? Well, at this point, you can see why it could have been, right? And honestly, Hollywood almost agreed in 1990 when director John Lee Hancock, known today for films like Snow White and the Huntsman or Saving Mr. Banks, he was just getting started in the film industry. He actually wrote a full screenplay about the Santa Claus bank robbery and the lynching that followed, but despite the unbelievable source material, no studio picked it up. The story did inspire writers though. In 1958, J.W. Sitton released the first book dedicated to the robbery, fittingly titled The Santa Claus Bank Robbery. In 1984, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram praised it as, quote, the most accurate narrative available. And in 1972, journalist A.C. Green put his own take, a blend of fact and fiction, also titled The Santa Claus Bank Robbery, helping cement the event as a permanent piece of Texas folklore. And most recently, in 2023, author Thomas Goodman released The Last Man, a novel of the 1927 Santa Claus bank robbery. The book takes the known facts about Robert Hill, who was the only surviving member of the gang, and imagines the emotional and moral journey that might have led to his eventual reform. Because here's the incredible part. Robert Hill lived until 1996. By then, he had spent more than 50 years as a married, model citizen, a man who quietly rebuilt his life after surviving one of the most infamous crimes in Texas history. No more guns, no more getaways, no more headlines, just an ordinary life worlds away from the chaos he helped create in 1927. And that's the story, my friends, of the Santa Claus bank robbery of 1927. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, and don't forget to follow so that you don't miss the next one. Thank you all for listening today, and until next time, goodbye.